All right, we've come to the third and final lecture on the third and final chapter of Lewis's splendid little work, The Abolition of Man, which I read with delight and with edification every time I read it, to the third lecture, which is itself entitled The Abolition of Man. And in it, we find the deep suspicion that he has already harbored about modernist educational projects and about subjective morality and about progressive scientific planning come to its fruition, particularly when he comes to what replaces an education system that would have promoted the Tao. What takes its place then? If we don't have people who have been educated to fly, much as young chicks will fly following their parents and following the example and exhibiting the moral virtues that their parents would have and had been passed on to them from time immemorial following the Tao. What would replace that then? In the third chapter, he gives us what would replace that then, namely the abolition of man. And he writes these rather chilling words: the final stage is come when man, by eugenics, by prenatal conditioning, and by education and propaganda based on a perfect applied psychology, has obtained full control over himself. Human nature will be the last part of nature to surrender to man. The battle will have been won. So this is the warning that Lewis gives us and gives us back in 1943, almost 80 years ago now, that if any age, and again, I'm quoting the book, if any age, one age really attains by eugenics and scientific education, the power to make its descendants what it pleases, all men who live after it are the patients of that power. And far from being freer and better humans, these new creatures will be, quote, weaker, not stronger. For though we may have put wonderful machines in their hands, we have preordained how they are to use them. And as a result of this biotechnology, man's conquest of nature, if the dreams of some scientific planners are realized, means the rule of a few hundred of men over billions upon billions of men. So Lewis is warning about a new world order, and one in which it strangely sounds a lot like we've experienced over the past 2 years under lockdown, where we are at the beck and call and at the whims of the scientists who appeal to science to justify their moral incursions into our lives. And Lewis is not opposed to science. He is, however, opposed to scientism, the idea that science, in addition to its expertise in the areas of science, also has expertise in moral judgment, the very things which the Tao is animated by. He says that scientists know nothing about that, or nothing more than your average common day person on the street does, and perhaps less. And so, although scientists are obviously to be heeded on matters related to their area of expertise, they are not to be deferred to in matters on which they have no competence, namely in the areas of areas of freedom and of politics and of ethics. They can't tell us what ought to happen. They can tell us what is happening. They ought not to be telling us how to respond to things, but rather telling us what the problem is. And this is the problem that Lewis addresses here, and it's one that he's addressing in his contemporary audience. And again, he appeals to eugenics and neonatal conditioning and so forth. The very sorts of things that we see in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World are being discussed as well. Very much a contemporary novel, by the way. Huxley would have taught at Eton College, would have taught George Orwell, who is again another writer that we could draw upon with great deal of benefit at this point. And the problem is that the new human nature that will ensue will mirror the moral vision founded on a very unexamined mythology, such as progress and evolution, which shape human planning. Now, if you want to apply this contemporary world, and we're going to do this more in our discussions together rather than me talking about it in a lecture, you will find, however, in the World Economic Forum of our day, discussions by various authors to this very end on and under the title of transhumanism and so forth, and engineering or hacking the human genome, and the desire to improve humanity and make it more obedient, and make it and limits its freedom for the purposes of goodness. Now, Lewis here is a defender of an old way of looking at things, a way that I myself also hold, which is that of the Tao and the defense of freedom, individual liberty, all of the liberties in which we can find our Canadian Constitution lays hold of, and also some of which are expressed in our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which have been set aside for the last 2 years. But appealing to progress and evolution or safety or things that are going to improve our lives, or at least protect us, allow for even more scientific planning. And you'll note that not only have the scientists, through their appeal to algorithms of the threats and the risk factors of various COVID strains have ruled our lives, but so too have we seen that the beneficiaries of this new regime have been the scientists themselves. And this is one of the things that, again, our friend that I cited last time, the rapper Shad, brought to our attention as well, this very thing, that it is beneficial, but the benefit is for whom? For whom is the benefit? It is said to be benefit for man, but Lewis has some questions about this. And he says, the power of man to make himself what he pleases will be the power of some men to make other men what they please. So these man molders will be given a power through an omnicompetent state and through their irrepressible scientific techniques, so that we get what Lewis in the first lecture called conditioners, who are given the power to determine not only our lives, but the lives of posterity going forward in any shape that they please. And Lewis, again, called these the conditioners. So what does he mean by the conditioners? Well, he does mean the educators, but he means it more broadly than that. He also means it to refer to the scientists and the bureaucrats, for whom things like values and emotions are just physical phenomena that they can produce or repress through techniques of advanced psychology, through pharmacology, through pills, and so forth. So values are something moral, even moral responses are something that the transhumanists explicitly will say that they want to control and believe that they can control. And they will say that they will acquire the capacity to produce conscience and decide what kind of conscience they will produce. Now, if you think this is a little bit far-fetched on my part, you will find that there is a great deal under the guise of transhumanism that's been taking place in Silicon Valley over the last few decades, in Cambridge University, the University of Oxford, Nick Bostrom, among others. And he will present the idea that scientism is using the idea of, again, referring back to the way last time, of seeing through nature by deconstructing all of its processes, including human being itself, to the point where we are simply matters of physical causality. So, and the ultimate aim is to bring human nature under human control, to act as gods, determining good and evil. And Lewis portrays this in his fiction, in his science fiction trilogy in particular in the third installment of that, which he calls That Hideous Strength. So the very idea, which is in the Tao of the propagation of the human race, is not considered evil itself, but it is considered morally insufficient. And in our day, it's actually rejected as being good at all. So we want to erase carbon footprints rather than to propagate human life. Now, life for the sake of life is no good unto itself, but by ignoring the Tao, it certainly can become so. And so Lewis talks about this in various ways in The Abolition of Man. Let me pick up the book here and talk a little bit more about that. But let me give you a a taste of the sort of discussion on this. And again, I mentioned Nick Bostrom, who's an Oxford University philosopher and one of the founders of contemporary transhumanism. He describes the orientation in these terms. He says, transhumanists view human nature as a work in progress, a half-baked beginning that we can learn to remold in desirable ways. Current humanity need not be the end point of evolution. Transhumanists hope that by responsible use of science, technology, and other relational means or rational means, we shall eventually manage to become post-human, beings with vastly greater capacities than present human beings have. So they take the notion, which we have derived from Charles Darwin, of the evolution of the species. And I mentioned this at the outset of the whole lecture series, that Lewis saw a sort of a tipping point for the move away from the old morality and the old way of operating on which he calls the Tao, that went from the ancient world, whether pagan or Christian, all the way up until that time and governed it, to the new sense of humanity in his day. Evolution does something rather different with that. And what it suggests is that human nature is no different than animal nature. That it may have evolved to be something superior, but nonetheless, there's nothing distinctive about human nature per se. And since there's nothing distinctive, there's also nothing sacred about it. It removes the account of Genesis, whereby we're created in imago Dei, and replaces it with the idea that we are the creature of instincts and drives and passions and so forth, but without acknowledging the distinctively human faculties of reasoning and also of speech. This is a point I make in a lecture I gave this on the kingdom of speech, and about something that I think has been overlooked about human nature, and namely this capacity for using language as a means of understanding and as also as a form of reasoning, which is being denied in our day, even in the academy itself. The legitimacy of reasoning, it's considered to be, in some sense, an assault on us. Appealing to reason is a white thing, or it's a European sort of habit, but it's not something that actually governs people that don't want to live under those auspices. Well, in accordance with the Tao, this idea of thinking that reasoning and moral reasoning is invalid because of its origins is just not only a specious form of argumentation, but it's sawing off the branch that we're all standing upon, which is the branch of human nature. And by so doing, it may think that it has a moral good in mind, the end of perfecting human nature. But what it doesn't do is and it begs the question, it doesn't tell us what human nature is that it's going to perfect. I mean, Nick Bostrom referred to the rational use of these things, and the use for desirable ways, but these are all just begging the questions. Desirable for whom? In what sense is it rational? In what sense is it improvement? What was deficient in the previous human nature that we needed to improve? By improving it, how are we not making experiments on people? How thereby are we not contradicting the very standard of ethics which reigned from the time of the Nazis till the present day, at least until 2 years ago, namely the Nuremberg Code of Informed Consent? And some of you who've studied psychology here at Tyndale, and in general, you will know this, that in order for medical operations to be done upon you or any sort of scientific studies, you have to consent and give your consent to the person doing the operation. This is the same case if you go to the doctor. You have to agree, tick a box, sign that you are agree and you're not going to hold the person liable, but you understand all of the risks, and here are the risks, and look at them all. You are going to agree to that. But if the ends are so different as to not want to preserve the human and to perfect it and move on from it, what happens to informed consent? Is it something that we will want to hold on to, or is it rather an impediment to the desires of the transhumanists? And note that the end of transhumanism is what Bostrom calls posthuman, beings with vastly greater capacities than present human beings have. There's a side to that he does not mention. Posthumanism will regard there to be no essential, and this is inherent in the evolutionary idea to begin with, there is no essential difference between a human being and an animal, or a human being and artificial consciousness, AI. And thus there is no reason to preserve human life. After all, we're seeking to evolve beyond that in ways that enhance it. Well, enhance it in what ways? Well, artificial intelligence enhances it in the rapidity with which it can do calculations. Does it enhance it in its moral capacities? Does it acknowledge the Tao? I'm not sure the binary code ever purports to make moral judgments like that, or the sophisticated, or let alone sees itself within the tradition of the Tao to be able to allow itself to do that. So with that in mind, Darwin's notion of natural evolution, a slow process, can be augmented by science. Human beings can participate in it by technological means. And we are no longer seen as the crown of creation, which would still be the case in Darwin. We're at the peak of the evolutionary ladder, but rather a step or a step ladder towards something infinitely greater, the post-human, whatever that is. And note that it's not defined. It's simply superior. And if we take the idea of the survival of the fittest, what it means is that the current people that we call people will no longer be worthy of survival for those who will be define themselves as post-human. Now, if you think I'm being alarmist on that, I'm just tracing out the logic to this. And it's quite clear if you read the writers in the transhumanist circles that the post-human future isn't limited by biology, evolution in the biological sense. It will involve the merger of human beings with machines through the so-called cyborgs, so mechanical augmentation, but eventually even implanting human consciousness in mechanical devices. This is being discussed in science fiction, of course, but it's also being discussed actively and openly in these circles, transhumanist circles. And so in the work by Yuval Noah Harari, Homo Deus, A Brief History of Tomorrow, we will find a vision in which individual human experience and the ethical issues have evolved to the point where we can paint a vision which goes beyond the current status of humanity. And he closes that book with this question: what will happen to society, politics, and daily life when non-conscious but highly intelligent algorithms know us better than we know ourselves? Well, that would only be possible if it had those highly intelligent algorithms had access to all of the aspects of ourselves, which are currently being envisaged with a digital ID, which will trace us and identify us in accordance with our various characteristics and will track our behavior. And you can be sure, given the fact that it's a transhumanist endeavor, it will seek to improve our conduct. And so the idea of human free will and the idea of a moral nature, which is, again, what we're going to refer to as the Tao, are things which are becoming redundant in the transhumanist abolition of man. Now, towards the end of the Abolition of Man, Lewis argues that modern science requires restraint. And it's a restraint that it won't itself provide. Why? Because scientists are not schooled in the Tao. They don't recognize the need for restraint. They're motivated by the desire to discover new things. And in fact, they're funded to do precisely that and find things that are useful and marketable and productive. And so they're going to overlook the ethical restraints which might have restrained their predecessors. This is what modern science fiction has presented as a horror scenario all along, from Victor Frankenstein to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde to on to, I guess we could say, the Lord of the Rings. So the rapid triumphs of modern science, in Lewis's estimation, have been purchased at too high a price, and it ought to be submitted to deeper and more and older human truths, in Lewis's estimation. He says that they ought to reconsider and maybe even repent. And he says only a regenerate science will recognize the wisdom of buying knowledge at a lower cost than that of life. And so he sees, Lewis does, in a way which makes him, to my mind, rather prophetic, the threat of a coordination of technology, psychology, ethics, and even government to the future of the human race. And says if the scientists themselves cannot arrest the process before it reaches the common reason and kills that too, then someone else must arrest it. Now, this is quite the thing to say in a lecture. It has to be stopped. It was not, however, stopped. It has not been stopped. The use of biotechnology we have seen in the mRNA vaccines themselves, which were experimental and remain experimental. We don't know the long-term effects of mRNA vaccines. The post-human future that Lewis is concerned about is not just somebody who's a bioconservative or something of that sort. He seems to be talking about a threat which all of humanity ought to share, because they're all involved, because their very nature is at stake. And he concludes the Abolition of Man with a discussion, and it's really an interesting, and it almost seems like a tangent, with a discussion of magic and science in the 16th and 17th centuries. He calls them twins, magic and science. Born at the same time, under the same circumstances. He notes that the indulgence of magic really takes off in the scientific era, not in the medieval period. He doesn't see any evidence of that at all, in fact. It's not there in the early Renaissance, but it is there later on. And he says that while magic eventually died, the science grew and flourished, and yet they were both seeking the same end, and by similar means. He says, for magic and applied science, the problem is how to subdue reality to the wishes of men. The solution is a technique, and both, in the practice of this technique, are ready to do things hitherto regarded as disgusting and impious, such as digging up and mutilating the dead. Well, now we're on the verge of doing this with genetic structure, which is a far deeper and more troubling development. And we're talking about genetic implants. We're talking about technological implants. We're talking about chips, microchips, subdermal. We're talking about behavioral conditioning. We're talking about chemical conditioning. We're talking about, as I say, digital IDs, where we'll get a social credit score. These things are not in the distant future. These are in the near future. And so I want to commend to you one final book, which you will find interesting as well. And it covers to some degree the same sort of ground. And I found it very helpful myself. And this is one by Neil Posthuman called Technopoly. He talks about the whole culture, whereby culture has been surrendered to technology. And it was written 30 years ago, but it seems as prescient and as relevant as when it was first written, just as Lewis's does. So these are the issues that Lewis raises in the Abolition of Man. And he really wants us to think about these things. And I think it's incumbent on us to do that in this course on Christianity and culture. The dominion mandate, which was given to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, did that dominion extend to the point where they could be or could regard themselves not only as the masters of their own souls, but the governors of other people's souls, as taking the cultural mandate of Genesis 1:28 to the extent where they could cultivate human beings and reform them in new ways, condition them such that they were no longer human, and they thought that that was a good thing. I'll leave you with that thought.